Hi there. Welcome back to Revelations at the Table, where scripture meets conversation. I am your host today, and it is only me. However, I believe that God's presence fills every seat. Let's dive in. We've walked with Adam and Eve in the garden, and we've journeyed through Jacob and Esau. But today we're going to be sitting down with Joseph. Joseph went from being a dreamer to being thrown in a pit. However, it was only his journey towards his palace. Sometimes we see the dream so clearly, but the path to it feels like contradiction. And so today I want to invite you to lean in, because maybe, just maybe, the very thing that broke you is the thing that God is about to use to build you. Let's dig in. So for today, we are going to be reading out of Genesis chapter 37. 37 verse 5 to 9. Okay. And the word of the Lord says, Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose, and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. So here we see that Joseph was only 17 years old. He was young, he was hopeful, he was full of energy and full of promise. And he dreams that his brothers' bundles of grain bow down to his bundle of grain, right? And later on he dreams that the sun and the moon and the stars all bow down before him. And so imagine being that young and seeing all this promise, seeing something so big, so God-sized. You definitely have to go and tell someone. You won't be able to keep that to yourself. And so that is exactly what Joseph did. He went and he told his brothers. He went and he told his father. And so instead of them celebrating, jealousy arose. They laughed at him, they judged him, and all of a sudden they hated him. And so here's what we often miss about this section, that the dream was true, but the timing was off. So God had given Joseph a dream, but it was not yet time for the dream to manifest. Right? So sometimes God gives you a glimpse of destiny, not to launch you, but to locate you. Right? And He shows you who you are before you're ready to even carry that. Right? So that is exactly what happened when Joseph had these two dreams. And so if He didn't show him the promise, he wouldn't understand the process. So God had to prepare him by showing him what was going to happen, what was ahead. And so God gave Joseph the dream early, because this dream was exactly what would anchor him later in the future. Right? So if Joseph didn't go and tell his brothers about the dream, he never would have ended up in the pit. But this was all part of God's plan. Right? And so when Joseph found himself in the pit, when he found himself in the prison, he remembered, no, this is not all. God promised me so much more. And that is exactly how this dream anchored him. And that is why God showed him this dream in advance, before the time, before he was even mature enough to find himself in that space. And then I want to ask, have you ever felt that tension, where you know exactly what God promised, right? But what's currently happening is exactly the opposite. Have you ever felt that way? I want us to go to Genesis chapter 7, verse 23 to 24, which says, So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. And then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water into it. So Joseph's brothers couldn't handle the dream. They couldn't understand how could my grain bow before your grain? How could the moon, the stars, and the sun bow before you? Who are you? And so jealousy blinded them, right? They stripped him of his robe, the symbol of favor, and they threw him into a pit. Now the pit was dark, the pit was empty, it was silent. But from that moment, that is when Joseph's life changed forever. Because the pit wasn't punishment, it was rather protection. Because Joseph's brothers wanted to kill him, right? And if he had not found himself in the pit, they would have found another way to kill him. And sometimes the thing that looks like your lowest moment is only God's protection for you. And we see that if Joseph had to stay at home, his brothers would have found another way to kill him, right? If he tried to fight back, they would have eventually killed him as well. But the pit, the dark place, the lonely space was Joseph's gap between death and destiny. And have you ever found yourself in a pit season? Have you ever found yourself in a pit season? The kind of season where you feel stuck, the kind of season where you feel abandoned, the kind of season where you feel lonely. What if instead of burying you, God is planting you? And then I want us to dive into verse 23. We are so busy with chapter 37 all the way. And in verse 23 it says, So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they ripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. So if we read before this, we see that Joseph was given a coat with many colors. And this represented the favor that came from his father. And when Joseph's brothers ripped the colorful tunic from him, they thought that they were stripping him of his identity. But the truth is, they only took the fabric. They couldn't take the favor. The coat came from his father, but the favor came from his father in heaven. So even though they tried to take the coat, they couldn't take what was within him. And sometimes God allows people to take things from you, jobs, opportunities, titles, recognition, just to prove that what He's given you goes deeper than what others can touch. And that is exactly what happened here. They thought by taking the coat, they would take his identity. They thought by taking the coat, they would take his favor. But they only took the fabric. They couldn't take what was within him. And so your value isn't stitched in color, it's written in covenant. You might have lost something that used to make you feel seen or special, a job title, recognition. But the truth is, what God placed inside of you, no one on the outside of you can take it. The coat was temporary, the calling was eternal. Let's go to Genesis 39, verse 2 to 3. It says, Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph was sold into slavery, far from home, with nothing left but his faith. And the Bible says the Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered. Notice that Joseph wasn't prospering in the palace. He was prospering in Potiphar's house. Why? Because God's presence doesn't depend on your position. I'll say that again. Joseph was prospering in Potiphar's house, not in the palace, not where he was supposed to end up. He was prospering before that. And why was that? Because God's presence doesn't depend or isn't dependent on your position. So whether you're cleaning floors or sitting behind a desk, the favor of God, God's presence, isn't dependent on your position. So now we see that in Potiphar's house, Joseph learned stewardness, he learned leadership, he learned excellence. But the greatest test came from Potiphar's wife when she tried to tempt him. And I want us to go there. Verse 6. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, Lie with me. But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. So here we see that Joseph was offered pleasure, right? He was offered pleasure. No one was going to know, right? But he chose purity. He had everything. He was favored. He owned, basically. He was in charge of everything in the house. But he wasn't greedy. Because if he was greedy, he would have wanted the very thing that he didn't have, that he wasn't in charge of, which was Potiphar's wife. But he chose purity. He said, how could I do such a thing and sin against my God? How could I? And we see how Potiphar's wife went and lied about the whole thing. But you know what? Joseph might have lost his reputation, but he kept his integrity, right? And integrity is what keeps the dream alive when nobody is watching. Sometimes you won't get credit for doing the right thing. Sometimes you won't be acknowledged for doing the right thing. Sometimes you won't be noticed for doing the right thing. But God saw Joseph say no. And heaven kept a receipt. When no one applauds you, remember, God is still taking notes because He sees it even though no one sees it. He saw Joseph say no even though no one saw it. Right? Now I want us to stay at chapter 39, but I want us to go to verse 20 to 23. And it says, Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And I want you to see, the Lord was with Joseph. Remember I said earlier, God's presence doesn't depend on your position. God's presence was with Joseph when he was in the pit. His presence was there when he was with the Ishmaelites. His presence was there when he found him in Potiphar's house, and his presence was still there in the prison. God's presence doesn't depend on your position. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. So now we see Joseph's obedience got him locked up for something he didn't do. So he didn't give in to Potiphar's wife, and so he got locked up. But the word says again, the Lord was with Joseph. Even there, behind walls, forgotten by men, God's favor was visible. And I want us to read further. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. It came to pass, chapter 40, after these things, that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their Lord and the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. And so the two of them, we see that Joseph made two other men in prison, the cupbearer and the baker, which are these two, right, that were thrown into prison. Chapter 40 verse 5 says, Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them. Each man's dream in one night and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, "We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter." So Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." And then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream was a vine." Joseph interpreted both of these dreams. So he was practicing what would one day open up a door for him. But he wasn't practicing in a palace. He wasn't practicing in Potiphar's house. He wasn't practicing in a comfortable place. He was practicing in prison. And the treasure here is your gift still works in dark places. Your gift still works in uncomfortable spaces. Your gift still works in spaces that you don't want to be. You don't need a stage for God to use you. You just need a willing heart. That prison became Joseph's classroom, right? He learned humility, he learned leadership, and he learned empathy. And sometimes the walls God allows around you are not meant to trap you, but to train you. I'll say it again. Sometimes the walls God allows around you are not meant to trap you, but to train you. Joseph was trained when he interpreted the dreams of the chief baker and the cupbearer. He was trained because when his real calling came up, when he had matured enough, when it was time for the dream to come to pass, he was ready. He had been trained. I want us to go to Genesis chapter 40 verse 14. It says, "But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house." When Joseph was interpreting the chief butler's dream, he said to him in verse 14, "But remember to me." So remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness and mention me to Pharaoh. Right, and then we go on to chapter 41 verse 1. It says, "It came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river." And they tell us the dream. Verse 8, "It came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians." Verse 9, "Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day." Verse 11, "We each had a dream." Verse 12, "Now there was a young Hebrew man with us." Right, so Joseph interpreted the cupbearer's dream and promised to remember him. But the last verse says, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." And we see 2 full years passed. 2 years, no letter, no visitor, no word, nothing, silence. Have you ever felt like someone that you helped has forgotten you? You poured out, you gave your best, and they moved on. That is what happened here. That is exactly how Joseph felt, right? The cupbearer may have forgotten him, but God didn't. Because while Joseph was waiting, Pharaoh was starting to dream. And at the perfect time, God connected the dots, right? And suddenly the butler remembered there was a man, a Hebrew man in prison, as you can see here in verse 12. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us. So suddenly, after 2 years, 2 whole years, God was working. In one moment, Joseph went from the pit to the palace, from prison to the palace. And you may feel like your time has passed. You may feel like your time has passed, but your name is being mentioned in the rooms you haven't walked in yet. Joseph's name was being mentioned in the palace. There was a young Hebrew man. It was mentioned in a place where he has never even found himself in, a place that he never even imagined himself in. It was mentioned. So God's timing is never early, never late. And when the time is right, He'll make sure that the right people remember you. Just like the right person, the cupbearer, remembered Joseph. When Pharaoh shared his dreams, I want us to go to chapter 41, 39 to 41. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all of this, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." Look at that. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then I want us to go to 45, 4 verse 8. Joseph revealed to his brothers. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. And he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you have sold in Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save their lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." I want us to go to chapter 50, verse 20. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for I am in the place of God. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God made it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." When Pharaoh, if you read, I want you to go back and read. I want you to go back and read. I'm not going to be able to get to read everything, but I want you to go back and to read. When Pharaoh shared his dream, Joseph didn't panic, right? He interpreted it with clarity and wisdom. He didn't want anything in return, right? He did what he was called to do. And instantly, Pharaoh promoted him. He said in chapter 41, "You shall be over my house, and only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And so we see that there were years of pain, years of uncomfortability. And in this moment, in that one conversation, all of it made sense. The pit made sense. The temptation made sense. The prison made sense. The 2 years of nothing made sense. All in that one conversation. It says, "You shall be over my house, and only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." Every test had trained Joseph for this moment. Every test. And as we were reading, I read to you the scriptures that are relevant to what I'm saying. When Joseph's brothers finally stood before him, afraid for their lives, Joseph didn't seek revenge. He could have killed all of them. All of them in that moment. He could have killed them. But he wept and he said, "You meant it for evil, but God has meant it for good." He said, "You didn't send me here, God sent me here." Purpose redeems pain. God never wastes a wound. Never, ever. He turns every single betrayal into a bridge. And I want to say to you today that maybe your pain doesn't make sense yet. I feel it when I say that. Maybe your pain doesn't make sense yet. But the same God who was with Joseph in the pit is with you in your process. The same God who was with Joseph in the prison is with you in your process. And when all of it is done, you'll be able to look and say, "It hurt, but it helped me become who I was meant to be." Being thrown in the pit by your brothers, by Joseph's brothers, it hurt, but it helped him become who he was meant to be. Being tempted, being lied about, it hurt, but it helped him become who he was meant to be. And then I read verse 50. I just want to read it again. It says, "Joseph said to them, 'Do not be afraid, For am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people. Now therefore, do not be afraid. I'll provide for you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph looked at the same brothers who betrayed him, and he blessed them. He looked after their little ones. He looked after them and their families. That's real freedom. Forgiveness is what turns trauma into testimony. This was a testimony. Joseph didn't just save Egypt. He saved the people that broke him. And so maybe that's where God is leading you. Not to prove them wrong, but to show them grace. Because when you choose to forgive, you're not saying that what they did was right. You don't excuse what they did. You just choose to not let it chain you anymore. That's all. Joseph's story shows us that purpose isn't linear. It's not a straight line. It's not a straight path. Right? It's messy. It's unpredictable. It's tiring. It's uncomfortable. Right? But it's holy. And the pit was never punishment. The prison wasn't wasted time. It was all part of Joseph's training. All of it. Each and every bit of trial was part of Joseph's training. So if you're listening today from your pit, if life feels unfair, confusing, painful, uncomfortable, I want you to remember that the same God that was with Joseph is with you right now. And so I want to end off by saying, your pit is not the end. It's the passage to your purpose.